We will now start with the next panel, which is which paths towards a monetary system that enables a dignified life and a healthy environment. And we will start our first contribution with Arndt Hopfmann. Arndt studied economics and African studies at the Karl Marx University in Leipzig between 1977 and 1982. He holds a PhD in development economics. In his academic career, he took up various positions with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and he's currently a research and senior advisor on economic and trade issues for the foundation.
Yeah, good afternoon. Glad to be here, and also, although I work with the foundation for a while already, I celebrated my 20th anniversary of being employed with this institution. I'm still surprised what our offices all around the world are able to organize, and impressive stuff, in particular this conference. So this is now the last serious session, and I find myself in a little strange situation. The first thing I have to admit, I dare to put $1 trillion question as a headline over my presentation. So how to deal with the money and development. This is so I do not expect this is the, let's to say, the speech that will get me the Nobel Prize, but even less, because after being now in the last session of the conference, after so many days of interesting debates, I must actually admit that everything what I am going to say has already been said. So, and this is the negative thing, so don't expect a lot new things. And the positive aspect is, yes, it has been said, everything has been said, but not by everyone. So, and that's me now. Okay, as I already said, I changed the title, and what I'm going to do is to give a short presentation, mostly focusing on the lessons that I developed in this paper. And the whole, let's say, the secret title of the whole thing is Capitalism is Too Serious to Leave It to the Capitalists. Because other people than capitalists are also affected. And this now leads me to my real agenda, and this is also not written in the paper. The first thing I'm aiming at is to convince you, or to tell you that from my perspective, such a thing like economic and monetary sovereignty is in vain. As in a capitalist society, and I'll come back to this in a minute, there is no such thing like monetary and economic sovereignty underneath, let's say, for different countries, underneath in regional areas also. This is a global economy from the very beginning and has been gone globalized, or even more over the 400 years of existence. And that's why I also believe that globalization is not the process of the last 40 or so years. Globalization is the ongoing process of Marx, of which Marx said, this is the tendency, the progressive tendency of the capitalist mode of production to create the world market. So this is globalization, I understand. And the second point of my hidden agenda is that I want to come to the conclusion, I'll explain to you, that money is not that important for development as one may believe, in particular in the framework of such a conference. So what did I do in order to sustain these two conclusions, so to say, major conclusions? I tried to compare two modern monetary theory, which is also sort of point of reference. One extreme concept of the capitalist society, which is based more or less on the ideas of monetary Keynesianism. And then I want to sustain, in particular, my second idea that money is not so important as it seems. this is when we come back to the political economy of communism. Having said this, I just, because we are also celebrating some important days during the conference, I would like to remind you today is the 3rd anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And since I'm an East German, it's for me also a day of self-liberation, which is, for some people from the West, they believe that they put in the wall from their side, but there is a lot of proof that the East Germans pushed the ball over from the East to the West. So this is just what I wanted to remind you. Okay, that's why also Kornai and the political of communism is a very important thing. So, having said this, let's start with monetary Keynesianism. And monetary Keynesianism is basically a theory that that is more to Marx and more to the basic understanding of capitalism than any other, let's say, post-Marxian theory, because the basic assumption is that capitalism is a money society, a money economy. So each and everything that is important has to take the form of money, and money is creating also the economic space. Then a certain currency, in their understanding, defines the economic space. So all countries or all, let's say, all territory that uses the same money is forming a single economy on its own. So that is the basis, and it's actually, so to say, to bring Marx's idea of that you have to have money. This money is going to be invested in physical things, then the production runs, and then there's a produce, and then there's what Marx called the salto mortale of the whole thing. The produce is sold and the surplus realized, and only then when the surplus is transferred back in more money than has been invested, the whole process has achieved its very sense. This also makes clear that capitalism is not about producing a certain good or a certain, satisfying a certain need. It is just the intention that you only can increase your fortune or your money, which is money wealth, by investing the whole thing. And unfortunately, the English language is not really appropriate to express the very meaning of this process. It's not investment. In France, it is mise à valeur, in German, Verwertung, meaning it's money that is going to be invested in order to create more money. So this is, so to say, the basis of the departure point of this monetary Keynesianism thing. And then, having said this, the consequence is that the money owner, the investor, so to say, is the most important person. And that since the money owner has his whole fortune is more or less only in money, he is always concerned about devaluation of money, so he is trying to optimize his portfolio or her portfolio. That means he is longing for stable currency, for stable, safe currency. That means all major money owners or moneyed men are longing in order to reduce the risk, to change their money in we say global money, hard currency. So and the challenge for each government is that to make these moneyed men hold their national currency. And we had this already yesterday. How can this be achieved? This is only be achieved when people or the moneyed people are willing to accept state debt, state bonds, to hold state bonds in the local currency. So I mean, the capacity of the state to make these people invest in state bonds shows that they accept the local money. So, but to make it acceptable, they have to offer a premium to these people, and this is the interest rate. So you can always issue debt as a state, as long as the interest rate is high enough to attract these people to buy your bonds. So, and this interest rate, so to say, the average interest rate or the necessary interest rate to keep these people buying bonds is the minimum profit rate that need to be achieved for investment in production or in productive activities. So, and the weaker a country is, the more it has to offer to the moneyed people to hold the national tender. And this then creates a so-called investment squeeze. So only investments that will at minimum achieve this interest rate will be profitable. And so if like in Brazil, for example, in 20 years ago, the interest rate is 15% or 25%, then it means that each and other investment that is producing a profit below 25% is not rational from the perspective of the investors. So this means that if the weaker your currency is, the more projects, the more useful production, it will not take place, there will be no investment. So your country is short in investments, and this means you will be a high unemployment rate. So, and this creates, seen on the international perspective, a kind of has already been said by someone yesterday, I think Anna Löscher also, a hierarchy of currencies. So then only the top, and this is the US dollar, this country can be, or the country or the government that can issue this currency can be seen as a sovereign country. All others are not sovereign. So even the euro, as we saw in 2007, 2008, is heavily depending on the US Treasury, because in this crisis, when the US Treasury would have declared that it no longer does accept euros as a currency on an unlimited basis, this would have meant immediately the collapse of the euro. So that this goes down, so you can say where you are. Maybe the US are the most sovereign, but all others are not sovereign. So, and this brings me to my first lesson regarding to MMT, and this lesson is that the quality of money matters. If you want to implement an MMT-inspired policy, you need to be aware that if you're not don't have dollar in your hands or euro in your hands or yen in your hands, you will be restrained. So the implementation of modern monetary theory in practical politics will depend on the quality of your money. So this is completely a blind spot from the theoretical outset, because it has been developed in the US. They didn't have these concerns. Okay, this is the first thing. The second thing is, now I'm coming to Kornai and the political economy of communism. Kornai, Janusz Kornai, you probably know him, has been writing about the particular economic problems of the Soviet Union or the Soviet bloc for a long time. And after the Berlin Wall came down, 2 years later, he published it's the summary of all his works, and this is called The Socialist System, Political Economy of Communism. And in the center of this argumentation is how did these societies function, and why are these economies shortage economies? So what is the problem with development, investment, and so why is there always shortage? Why can't they satisfy the demand to a certain extent? And then he came to the conclusion that although he calls the soft budget constraint, that these economies are not at all money constrained, but output constraint, physical output constraint. And the logic is the following. If you have, your aim is you have to survive in a hostile environment surrounded by capitalist economies, and you need to mobilize all forces, all means, everything that you can get held on to narrow the gap to survive. So, and you have a currency that's not just used for distributing consumer goods, not for more. As a consumer, you can't buy a tractor or any kind of productive use, because due to the plan will assign you what you can get access to, which resources, not the money in your pocket. The money of your pocket is completely unimportant for that. Meaning that there are only 3 factors that limit the output of these of the production. This is the workforce, this is the technology available, and it is the resources available. So that you have. So and the state, let's say the major aim of the state is to put as many people use as many people within the technology you have to process as much resources as possible with the most possible output. And the central plan is only, let's say, distributing these limited resources to certain purposes. So the question is, when you need rubber boots and you will also have to produce tires, then for the planning committee it is to say, how many rubber boots do you use with how many workers that are needed to produce these rubber boots, and what is the resources that you dedicate to the production of tires. So, and when you then have a problem, you need another harvesting machine, not done. So, and the harvesting machine is, the tires that are allocated to the harvesting machine production are finished. You may produce probably, which is also tricky because you don't need other inputs as well. You can't have tires, so may produce this harvesting machine, but you can't took it to the field because you don't have the tires. Because the tire producer will say, my plan is full and I have produced as much as I can on the limit of what I have. So we can't get additional tires.
You have 5 minutes left.
Yeah, except of this. This means that the whole thing is input constraint. So what is interesting when it comes to MMT, and this is my second observation, is that MMT wants to achieve a similar level of resource utilization only by monetary means, not by central plan means. So, and then you have to ask yourself, you have also to deal with the consequences. So in a shortage economy, or in such an economy that always runs in full steam, all resources employed, you will have shortage of labor, you will have shortage of output, you will have shortage in any regard, you will have massive use of all kinds of resources, regardless environmental impact of the use of these resources or whatever it is. And you will be constrained when it comes to external trade, because you can only export the stuff that you do not need, or that you can probably sell on the market with the level of productivity that you have, and then you can only import goods with the earnings that you got from the exports. So that means, in the case of Russia, is very much telling. Russia is probably the country that most succeeded with this forced development, what Conrad told it, but they are still a major raw material exporter, not a finished good exporter. Okay. This is, so to say, the second lesson, and now the third and the fourth are let's say, without any further explanation to the theoretical background. Third lesson, in my understanding, is that we need to understand, for real development, the physical nature of the produce matters. The physical nature of your endowment with resources matters. It is not to assume, while a lot of people are talking like, yeah, the surplus, this is a number, this is so and so much money, or so, this is 1 billion, 1 trillion, whatever. So, no, it is that all surplus in physical production exists as a physical good. So, and this is also you have to take into account that not everything is money per se. As Marx had already said, Salto mortale of the whole process is where the process comes to its very aim and end, is the produced good has to be sold on the market and has to be reconverted into money. Only then you can talk about surplus in monetary terms. And my fourth conclusion, or this was my last conclusion or lesson, is, and this has already been mentioned several times here during the last days. Policy matters even more. So you may have a problem with your foreign currency, you may have a problem with your export structures, but to overcome the situation in which you are, in order to improve the conditions of your position, in order to develop own technologies, to be able to have more sovereignty of your economic life, you have to use politics. You have to your politicians have to follow, yeah, I would say, brave and over a long time stable programs and plans in order to develop own resources, own technologies, to improve the situation from within. The domestic market matters, and policy is the crucial crucial input into that. So that is why there are not many successful countries in the world that managed to get through this process. Russia, and to a certain extent, was a successful, or is still a successful example, and they managed to become from a rural country until the Second World War to a country that was able to fight the Germans and to win the war. So this is, so to say, also an interesting success story. Whether it's really a success, and we can discuss this. But the other one is China. So unfortunately, only that. Not feel much more. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arndt. Our next speaker is Mehdi Ben Guirat. He teaches at the Laurentian University in Canada. His area of research is dependency and indebtedness in balance of payment-constrained economies. He has published articles on development and finance for development for the Tunisian economy and other developing countries.
Hello. Okay. Just when I thought that I'm going to be repeating a lot of things because we're in the last panel, and Fidel talked about a little bit of my stuff, Jan Kregel talked about a little bit of my stuff, and then there's maybe 10 other people talked about a little bit of my stuff, and then Arndt comes in, and then he talks about a little bit of my stuff. So I was like, I was like, where am I going with this? But anyway, I'll try to make it a little bit different, but then we'll see how it goes. So, balance of payment constraints, indebtedness, and economic sovereignty. Can MMT salvage Tunisia's economy? When I started working on the issues that face Tunisia, the first thing that I start looking at is just basically the current account balance. And okay, is the current account balance, and I was looking at it from a historical perspective, and it looked just strange and head-scratching, and it pretty much looked like something needs to be done. And then I started digging deeper into a little bit of institutional issues and other long-term issues, and it was fairly difficult in terms of how is Tunisia going to be able to get out of this mess by finding something that's a little bit outside the box and finding something that's not within the orthodox theory of growth. And then I started looking at it, and then I looked at the periphery and center theories, and it turns out I didn't know that most of it was a Marxist, coming from a Marxist background, and I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting. And then I started looking at other different theories. One of it is a Kaldorian Thirlwall theory that still looks at export growth models as actually a source of growth. And then MFT came in. And I'm like, okay, this is interesting. This actually might be some kind of a solution that's a breakdown, that's a break-in from everything else that Tunisia tried. So in this presentation, I'm going to go quickly over a state of affairs of this situation of Tunisia from a little bit of a historical perspective. And then I'm going to look at the problem of balanced payment, obviously, and the current account deficit. How does that reflect on the exchange rate and interest rates and a little bit of inflation? And we'll take a look at how MMT can provide a solution or not. So quickly, I think you heard it with Fadel Kaboub's presentation, a little bit how Tunisia went through its economic development. So independence in 1956. In the 60s, there's an import substitution program, just like every development country that's coming off of colonization. There's a semi-closed economy, imports were restricted, and you're trying to substitute the possible imports that you want by providing them from in-house production. The issue with that is that it didn't really relieve the unemployment problem. There's still extremely high unemployment, large people that needed to be employed. So this is when the export-led growth model was applied, again, just similar to a lot of other developing countries. And this export-led growth model is based on low-wage labor specialization. In the 80s, you've got IMF and World Bank programs to improve the competitiveness of Tunisian companies by having the structural adjustment program. 1990s, trade liberalization with a bunch of trade treaties. Financial liberalization in the 2000s. 2011, it's obviously the Arab Spring that started in Tunisia. And then anything after 2011 didn't really follow any specific policy other than just make sure that export growth model has been followed. And it's pretty much a patchwork economic policy, just trying to fill in the void here and there, not having a vision of where things need to be going. So this is what we have as far as the results of those policies. Slow growth in the last 60 years, slow wage increases, slow productivity increases, obviously because you have slow wage increases, high unemployment, growth with increase in inequalities, lots of environmental problems if you've been walking around Tunis a little bit, low quality of life, inaccessible healthcare that's becoming a little bit more of a problem right now, poor infrastructure, primary commodities-based growth, we'll look at a little bit of the statistics later on, balance of payment disequilibria, low technological spillovers, high exposure to international crises, and this is a point that I'll emphasize on a little bit more because I think it's the reason that Tunisia is in its situation right now is that it has an exposure to exogenous variables that has an implication on it that's very difficult for Tunisia not to get out of it. And over the long term, it's limited economic sustainability. Quickly, I'm going to go through why and how export growth models have been implemented. Well, obviously, the source of the issue is, as has been prescribed, is that Tunisia cannot really control its productive resources, and that it needs to accumulate enough capital that it doesn't have, which means that it needs to find that capital from outside Tunisia. So the solution as implemented or as prescribed by international organizations is you need to promote trade and financial liberalization. The option is bringing in more capital, export promotion policies, as I said, encourage specialization in labor-intensive manufacturers. Obviously, Tunisia is supposed to have a comparative advantage in its cheap labor, so that's supposed to help with bringing in FDIs. Tourism as a source of hard cash, FDIs again, facilitate conditional loans from overseas, and few quotes here to record that from the different meetings, international meetings, and through the World Bank or the IMF. If I just take the Monterey Consensus, for example, trade liberalization can substantially stimulate development worldwide, benefiting countries at all stages of development. So that's the line that's been pushed. Also, official development assistance plays an essential role as a complement to other sources of financial for development. So full-on liberalization program prescribed for countries like Tunisia and for Tunisia itself, obviously. And the theoretical background for it, just quickly, the Heckscher, and Samuelson model that's supposed to provide for factors of price equalization that allows for a decreasing gap between skilled and unskilled labor over the long term. So you start with hiring people that have unskilled labor, and as you provide more foreign capital that comes in from overseas, that gap is supposed to shrink, productivity is supposed to increase, and you fill in the gap the saving gaps that is a problematic gap for Tunisia, supposedly, which is that Tunisia doesn't have enough savings to finance that investment. So the access for necessary foreign capital is supposed to be the growth of that engine, and that foreign capital is supposed to be provided from international sources. So what did that do in reality, and how is that impacted in these statistics? And the first statistic that I want to take a look at is just the export-import ratio, and I'm going back to all the way to 1949. And on average, it's been relatively stable at about 70%. So 70% of the imports are covered by exports. There's a twitch here somewhere, which I'm not sure what it is. I don't know whether the data is correct or not, but it's just an outlier for 1957, 1959. The rest of it is fairly flat at about 70%. 70%, 56, 80. That's 70 years of data that strictly shows that Tunisia had a deficit in its current account for that long. So it's a head scratcher. You think, okay, well, something needs to be done, or there's a structural problem, and it has to change. And why is it the politicians haven't thought about changing that? Mind you, the service sector, though, has a positive balance, and the service sector is primarily based on tourism. So it balances it a little bit, but it's still, Tunisia needs to get capital inflows for overseas, and it needs to get indebted. Now, if you thought this is bad, that's 1948 to 2017, somehow I found data from Macquarie that has 10 years in the 1800s and 1840s. This is from 38 all the way to 1847. It's also the same percentages, that 65, 70, 64, with a couple of years in 1840 and 1843, where the coverage was more than 100%. Anybody know why that's more than 100% back in the 1800s? Fadel, do you know why? It is just, yeah, I'm going to answer you. Back in the 1800s, the only export that Tunisia had is farming products. So it's a couple of good years where it actually did rain. And it had a good crop. And they exported that beloved olive oil, that tree that keeps on giving. And that's about it. Those are a couple of years. They were good years. So it's not a very diversified economy even back then. And if we take a look at a little bit of what the exports are, the shares of merchandise, and this is 2001, 2012, and 2017, and I picked up the 2001 reference as far as the percentages, and these are the top exports. So minerals, that's at 17% in 2001. Textile clothing, that's 47% of the exports in 2001. And then vegetable, fruit, and olive oil, it's mainly olive oil, it's about almost 4%. And then insulated wires, that's about 473%. And that joins a little bit what Ms. Frauke was talking about in terms of insulated wires. That's car industry insulated wires that go, most of them, to German companies. But you look at the percentage a little bit, it was about 5% in 2001, goes to 10% in 2012, goes to 12% in 2017. And under the bigger category in the accounting system, the insulated wire is under mechanical industries. So if somebody does not really dig deep into why is it that mechanical industries has a relatively higher percentage in the exports, actually it's not just mechanical industries, it's just you're putting a piece of plastic on a piece of wire. It's a low value added, it's not really high value added production. So it's not something that's very fantastic. Now you see through the years though how mineral and fuel goes down, the share of export goes down from 17% to 10%. That's Tunisia not having enough oil to export and not enough phosphate to export. It does have phosphate, but there's social problems with the production of phosphate that made such the main company that produces phosphate has been shut down, almost shut down for the last 10 years. Textile and clothing, from about 50% of exports to 24 to 21% over the years. Tunisia could not compete with cheaper textile imports from China, from Bangladesh, from Vietnam. Actually, it's not China anymore now. It's Bangladesh and Vietnam and India that have even cheaper production facilities than Tunisia, even though Tunisia is closer to Europe and have weaker transportation costs, but it's still, because of its higher wages on average than East Asia, it got destroyed through better competitiveness, quote unquote. Olive oil is still at that same percentage, it's at 5%, and the insulated wires, obviously, it goes up a little bit. So it gives you a little bit of an idea. It's not a very diversified industry. This is, the prospect does not really look good. And mind you, in general, Tunisia has about maybe 15% primary sector, 25% industry, and the rest of it is services. So it's mostly geared towards services. But still, the export is not very diversified. And if we look at, this is based off the HH index, and if you're closer to 1, your industry is not that diversified. And if you're closer to 0, your industry, I have 5 minutes? Holy hell. So that's the diversity. Okay, so Tunisia is in red here. That gives you a bit of an idea. Algeria, which is mainly an export country, export a lot of oil. So it's not a very diversified industry. So what development model? Yeah, screw that. Okay, so quick to the Thirlwall model, which is a very neat model that explains what is happening when you have balance of payment constraints and why is the growth of your economy, and that's equal to epsilon z divided by pi. The epsilon and the pi are the income elasticity of demand for exports and income elasticity for demand for imports. And what it basically says, it says, if you want your economy to grow at a faster rate than the rest of the world, your income elasticity of imports has to be higher than your income elasticity of exports has to be higher than your income elasticity for imports, which means if your income goes up, your demand for imports has to be lower than your demand than what you actually export. If you don't reach that ratio, you're not going to go anywhere and you will not be development, which incidentally means that the value added of your imports has to be lower than the value added of your exports. As long as you're not reaching that, you're going to run a deficit no matter what. Hence the deficit that we saw on the curve for 70 years, actually for 150 years, that is not going to change. So this gives us an explanation, but it doesn't tell us what are we going to do. This is an important graph in terms of showing how much Tunisia is vulnerable to external shocks and how much its growth is based on exogenous variables. You don't want a country that is basing its growth on so many exogenous variables rather than things that you can do in-house. Tourism receipts about almost 8% of the GDP. Imports and exports put together is about 80% of the GDP. You just imagine that. That means any little thing that happens outside Tunisia will have a tremendous effect on the economy of Tunisia, whether it's war, economic recession in Europe, terrorist attack, whatever it is, it's extremely high. It's an exogenous variable that's very important. Average personal remittances at 5%, FDI, and then foreign debt is at 66%. This is an average from 1995 to 2018. And mind you, the indebtedness in Tunisia is about 100% of GDP. That's foreign indebtedness. I'm going to pass on this. And I'm going to pass on this. And I'm going to do this quickly. So this is a chart that looks complicated, but it's not very complicated. And it basically shows the flows between developed countries and underdeveloped countries, developing countries made in Tunisia. And this is the flow of exports and imports and how that actually does influence the economy. So there's imports of high value added products, export of low value added products, and at the same time, debt is coming into Tunisia, profits is leaving Tunisia, going to the center countries, that the exports needs the requirement of hard cash is a source of hard cash, and the imports needs hard cash. And the way it goes is because of the income elasticity of demand of imports and the income elasticity of demand of exports, you're running around and you're trying to balance your current account, but you're not able to do it. And add to that the directives of the IMF and the World Bank, which is to open up your economy even more, bring in more FDIs, make sure your export-led growth model is fairly strong, remove trade barriers, allow international firms to come in. That's going to make the whole circle even worse. So you've got loss of control of productive resources, vulnerability to market fluctuation, vulnerability to big multinational. It's just going to make things even worse and worse. And judging by the graph, it's not going to get any better. And it basically, you're trying to catch your tail and you can't find it, and you're looking at it, and I'm getting out of the deficit, and it's there, but, and then it just goes away. And so this is where MMT comes. I might need a couple of minutes extra. This is where MMT comes. Obviously, you know what MMT is by now, so I'm not going to repeat it. But the primary part of the MMT where I'm interested in is that monetary policy has limited effect, and that the state needs to reclaim its development role and use fiscal policy to help reach full employment on a sustainable level. So now that we know that the state can actually deficit spend, and it's not restricted the way we thought it is in the past, that means it's got that tool at least that it can use. So monetary policy, monetary policy has shown that it's limited, and you have to have the government that comes in and make sure that it reclaims its role. And few points as far as the fiscal policy, where the government needs to be identifying priority sectors that need to have the injection of the government expenditures, which means there's need to be to divert resources and create what I call champion programs. A little bit similar to import substitution programs back then, but within a market economy. Different countries have done it, in Japan and in Korea, and successfully did it. I'm not going to say that Tunisia needs to follow the same example, or any other developing country that has the same problems needs to follow the Japanese or the Korean, but at least as far as the presence of the government, if the private sector cannot do it, it's the government that has to step in. There's need to be an ideological shift in terms of how the government operates, that sometimes you have to have the government that steps in. And few programs that need to be prioritized, and Father talked about it a little bit, in most developing countries, whether it's CFA zone countries or Tunisia in terms of North Africa, there has to be a program that eliminates food dependency. It's a survivalist issue. That's the primary thing that needs to be taken care of before you move into anything else. That's a #1 priority. The second one is, also Fadel talked about it, it's the energy deficit. And also you need to identify high value added sustainable industries that have a spillover effect.
I have to ask you to wrap it up.
Okay, so I will wrap it up. And I'm going to wrap it up with just a simple, by going back to, not the dog, by going back to this graph, which is trying to eliminate as much as possible the impact of the exogenous variables on the Tunisian economy. You cannot grow as a country if you don't have a local market, a local economy that is developed enough, that's strong enough, that can sustain, that can absorb labor, that's strong enough, that can actually sustain shocks that would come in from overseas. So that's about it.
Thank you. Our next presentation will be from Max Agel, who is a researcher with the New Institute in Hamburg and holds a PhD in development sociology from Cornell University, where he wrote his dissertation on the Tunisian national liberation struggle and post-colonial planning. His academic articles and reviews in Middle East and North African agriculture and development theory have been published in various journals. And yeah, he's recently working on a book on the Green New Deal to be published with Pluto Press next year.
Thank you very much, and thanks again to all the sponsors and organizers of the conference. It's really fantastic. Usually, whenever I step outside of the kind of habitat of food and sovereignty area studies, no one is actually thinking that you can respectably discuss agriculture and food issues as a core element of economic development. This is because, in general, this is academia in the North, and it's assumed that you can get your food from the South, or the machines will do it. So I'm actually very happy that the conference opened up with a discussion about the use of sustainable agriculture as a fundamental element of economic development in peripheral countries like Tunisia, although I would actually broaden it to countries in the North as well, though not in this presentation. What I'm going to discuss is food sovereignty and indigenous knowledge, a peasant path to peripheral development. You can substitute peasant, smallholder for peasant, so we don't have to debate over that. The point is that it's people without a lot of land or without having large plots of land being at the core of a sovereign developmental program. And it is also something that applies in cases of constrained sovereignty, which I think is very relevant to this conference. It can actually invert the kind of typical post-colonial developmental sequence of where you were supposed to take state power and then you were supposed to build development or socialism or as it may be. I mean, it's actually something that you can build now, or you can build and fight, which is actually one of the slogans of an experiment in using food sovereignty in the US, in the South. So I'm just going to start with flip through very quickly some general numbers and maps from Africa on the whole, and then North Africa, and then Tunisia. It's very well known that there is systemic hunger in Africa, and these are, of course, Africa is still the most rural continent. And then we have African food imports and exports from 1970, which is when African agriculture slowly began to so-called modernize. We start to see growing and persistent gaps, and the gaps grow throughout the period of neoliberalization, or the openness to the global economy and the law of value operating more and more throughout the African continent. North Africa, we see the same pattern, in fact, in some ways even more acute throughout this period. And then in Tunisia, of course, we see the exact same pattern, and we see a huge jump starting in 1972 or so, which is when there was the shift to export-oriented industrialization in Tunisia. So we have a question of flows, right? We have uneven import-export balance, and there is a pattern within Tunisia and within the world system that is somehow producing these flows that are somehow then producing, an unbalanced import-export balance. Okay, so how do we locate the origins of these unbalanced flows? And I'm going to stick to Tunisia. I was originally going to talk about Africa, but I thought it's ambitious and ridiculous, so I'm just going to talk to what I know better. Tunisian rural class structure at the current moment, overwhelmingly 80% of Tunisian plots, and we're talking about 2 or 3 million people, are small farms, less than 10 hectares, producing for consumption and petty commodity production for the domestic market. Then you have a pattern of state-supported large cereal farms, which could be above 50, above 100, or above 1,000 hectares, heavily mechanized and capital input intense. And then there are medium and large and also subsidized and irrigated farms producing primarily for export, with fruits, specializing in fruits and vegetables. And then there's also, of course, dates and olive oils, which are export-oriented productions right now in Tunisia. And then you have a system of very minimal or zero credit to smallholders. And this is a systemic state policy dating back to the post-colonial period when they said, okay, well, we're not going to give money to, give any seasonal credit to the smallholders. And someone pointed out that that was the same policy as that the colonial power was carrying out, and the technocrats and the government just kind of shrugged. So, what are the mechanisms then that produce rural poverty and national food independence? And here I'm speaking a bit more generally, but also it very much applies to Tunisia. One, you have export-oriented commodity crops, cotton, coffee, cocoa, fruits, and vegetables for export. And then you have a system of import of needed food goods, primarily cereals. Then you have a pattern of minifundia, or very small plots, which means people don't have large enough plots to survive using prevailing production technologies, or they have to sell too much of their production at market prices to cover, for example, the loans that they've contracted because of a lack of state support. There's a price scissors effect. So people are relying on generally imported inputs, capital-intensive inputs, and then the prices of those, unless they're supported by the state, are going up faster than the commodity price itself. So what's cut is the social reproduction of the smallholders themselves. You have systematic state underinvestment in smallholder production and rural extension. So most of that is oriented towards the large landholders. You have overall an industrial technological paradigm. So in fact, you are thinking of a farm as a factory where you are looking to bring in what's called advanced, but in fact is Western technology primarily developed in Europe or the United States, and seeking to apply it to Tunisian conditions where none of the same conditions actually apply in terms of the labor land capital ratios are not the same, the ecological conditions are not the same, you don't have the same capital availability, none of it is the same, but nevertheless there is a predisposition to import these same forms of technology that were used to produce what's called development in the West. Finally, you have World Bank-backed or African Development Bank-backed system of petroleum-fueled water mining. So you actually have broken water cycles, and you are using petroleum, which is then producing part of the fuel deficit, to actually extract water from the ground, including unsustainably from aquifers. And this is, the World Bank will actually say, okay, we're going to support this project. It's going to have a 20-year horizon. Within those 20 years, the aquifer won't be exhausted. Therefore, it's a sustainable project according to our criteria. What happens in year 21? They claim, well, then they're going to shift to something else. They don't. Instead, you run out of water. And Tunisia is actually facing right now a massive water crisis. What are the systemic consequences of these policies? One, we have a permanent reserve army of labor, both in the slums and also in the countryside, where unemployment, especially in Tunisia, is much higher than it is in the cities. Two, you're embedded in a system of unequal exchange. You're exchanging tropical commodities for temperate cereals or manufactures. And tropical commodities also includes fruits and vegetables that are grown out of season so that they can be grown in Tunisia. At times they cannot be grown in the north. So you have a pattern in which Tunisia actually becomes the market garden for Europe. You have systemic rural-urban migration, which then produces slummification because you need massive investments in order to accommodate the swelling population in the cities. And this is a pattern that in fact goes back to the 1930s. So it is not new. You have metabolic rifts, so you have nutrients from the cities unable to return to the countryside, which is part of why you need imports, because the nutrients, the nitrogen, is not returning to the soil. You have a lack of an internal market because people are poor, and you have lack of internal articulation or intersectoral articulation. Combined, what do you get? You have dependency. Quickly, this is the definition of dependency I use, so we don't, it's not a debate over whether or not a country can industrialize. It's actually a question of the transfer of surplus value from a less developed national capital to a more developed national capital. So in fact, we're dealing with south-north or periphery core value flows. That and nothing else is dependency, and that's what we need to focus on when we want to understand the phenomenon. And we can come back to this question about what to do about dependency. But in the essence, what you need to do in a dependent situation is, as we heard from Professor Patnack, we need to delink. How? We need to break the mechanisms that produce south-north value flow. And here I'm talking about what actually needs to be done in the south, because that's where we're located right now. There's corollary northern obligations, which is to actually be anti-imperialist when southern countries actually attempt to implement these policies. So what needs to break are the unequal class structure, export crop reliance, technological imitation, foreign capital reliance, the import of experts, the ecologically unequal exchange patterns, which are widespread ecological degradation. Tunisia has having a comprehensive environmental crisis. And all of this, of course, is maintained and deepened through constant imperial violence. So how do we do this? One major sector, and I think the key sector for any economy of the global south, is through agroecology and food sovereignty as the unwalked peasant or smallholder path. I was very happy to see someone mention China, because it is the country that did successfully walk that path from 1950 to 1980 before the counter-revolution went in place and it started walking away from that path. But what you had was constantly increasing returns of productivity and income for smallholders and also urban dwellers, and that was actually done, and it's not really noted, through agroecology. So most of this, primarily, this was done through sustainable methods of agricultural intensification. Mao talked a lot about tractors, but in fact there were not very many tractors in China. It was done through green manures. It was done through night soil, or actually using human manure and applying it to the land. It was done through hand digging irrigation ditches. It was a lot of work, and what they got was a developed country. Originally, agroecology, as it is known now, and food sovereignty were Latin American popular theories of development based essentially on agrarian reform, investment in smallholder extension, a shift to agroecology, or zero capital input production, and also, as Via Campesina has broadened it out, to be against war, sanctions, and occupation, or the national question. What is agroecology? Agroecology is a system of farming that seeks to mimic natural systems, but actually to reorient them so that they produce a surplus for human use. Recycling of biomass, strengthening the immune system of the farming system by using organic pest control, using healthy soil, conserving water, energy, and enhancing synergies amongst various ecological and biological processes. Results of agroecology, and there's a lot of evidence now coming out about this, not so much evidence about Africa. This is part of imperialism, that Africa doesn't even have adequate knowledge of itself. But nevertheless, what we do know is that there's increased per land and per person productivity on these plats. Resultantly, in theory, you can have an increased national surplus. On per farm, you have reduced input costs, which means an increased amount of surplus per farm unit. Because you have an increased surplus and increased returns to labor, you are in fact empowering rural labor, and of course you're increasing resilience, biodiversity, and CO2 absorption, which allows you to deal with the ecological question and better resist global warming. I think I'm getting close to my 5-minute mark, so now we are moving on to the indigenous formulator. No? Okay, I'm good. I'll talk a little more slowly for the translators then. Now, in this part of the presentation, I want to move on and just discuss some of the theorists from Tunisia who were dealing with agroecology or other forms of popular and ecological development. Because actually, it's not very well known, but Tunisia actually had its own current of appropriate technology theories, of intermediate technology, of what eventually would be called agroecology. It was all developed in Tunisia in the 1980s, before Ben Ali came in. There was an opening for it for a variety of reasons, and there was actually a very advanced discourse, particularly around the University of Tunis, but also elsewhere in the agricultural research institutions, and also bringing in economists, engineers, agronomists, that systematically formulated basically an alternative development plan for Tunisia. It's too much to cover the whole thing, and so I'm going to focus on agriculture. The primary and pioneering figure was Salahdine El-Amami, basically Tunisia's first agroecologist, and what he put forward, tacitly inspired by the Chinese model, although it's, he couldn't mention it because he was working for the state, and they did not like China, was focused on technology and state support for the smallholder sector, and decreasing reliance on any forms of physical or costly intellectual inputs or the role or rule of foreign experts. He pushed for self-reliance but not autarky, and was in constant communication with the rest of the Arab states. He began with an ideology critique. So he systematically attacked what the neo-Nestorian or the post-colonial ruling party put in place as what modernity was and what it should be, and attacked them severely for dangling the mirage of an urban life, getting rid of centuries of prejudice, and downgrading in which the rural world bathed. For the historians, he thought, to modernize was to erase and surpass all the traditional systems of managing natural resources. What he thought was that the rural world should actually be the core of a sovereign developmental process, and he was peripherally involved in planning in the 1970s, although obviously the government did not very much take his work into consideration. And he called for a regional agricultural plan, decentralized against the centralizing state, and primarily depending on the mobilization of the creative will of the peasants capable of moving mountains and of defeating difficulties of all genres and of living with droughts in order to limit the havoc which could in this manner constitute a real tool of development in the rural world. And this really was a revolutionary descent in the 1970s of Tunisia. He also called for a national popular research program. So what he thought knowledge was absolutely essential to any form of development program, and basically thought that the national research infrastructure had to be totally reoriented according to norms developed endogenously to the country and not imported, not used as a relay for Western knowledge to arrive into Tunisia, which was inappropriate for Tunisia. He also thought this would be based on valorizing local species and local land races, or the indigenous plants of Tunisia. And he pointed out that a zoologist who would be interested in the pasturing of camels will be ridiculed. The growing of cactus is paralyzed, and a tree as noble as the date palm is totally ignored. He wrote these words in the early 1980s. And some of what he was referring to is that the government was actually raising the cactus that was working as windbreaks, and that was also serving as fodder for animals during droughts because it's a drought-resistant crop. The government was raising them during the cooperative program of the 1960s. Even though it was told otherwise explicitly time and again, it only stopped doing so when foreign engineers would tell the government, oh, maybe you shouldn't do that, and that's when it stopped. So there was no research program about how to valorize cactus, even though cactus is an appropriate fodder crop and also for human use, and it also has use for sustainable architecture within Tunisia. And then in talking about water management, he talked about the mobilization of natural resources. And he thought that what you needed to do was you needed to mobilize the available resources. What you needed not to do was put in place a huge dam network, which actually is a huge portion of Tunisia's current foreign debt is because of the dam program of the 1970s and 80s, which was often 50% of the agricultural budget during those years. And what's very interesting here is that he thought that there was a whole system of centralization, and what you needed to do was not centralize, but to disperse housing, decentralize hydraulic infrastructure, which would be adapted to the mobilization and exploitation of renewable energy and are also creators of employment. In other words, he wanted to match up the respective factors of production within Tunisia through national planning. What's particularly of note is the exploitation of renewable energy. This is in the early 1980s as well. And again, he was very firm on this. This was not necessarily based on an ecological critique. It was based on self-reliance, which is where you see the Chinese influence coming in. He's calling for a form of energy sovereignty based on using the dispersed forms of energy rather than the concentrated forms of energy encased in hydrocarbons. He wanted to basically use what we now know as renewable energy. He wanted to use wind energy, he wanted to use tidal energy, he wanted to use biomass, he wanted to use solar energy, including through things like using solar energy to power pumps in order to do sustainable irrigation in Tunisia. And another figure who I'm just going to briefly mention, still alive, Abdeljalil Badawi, who's working with the Tunisian Forum for Economic and Social Rights. He was calling for appropriate technology, which was very much an ascending kind of strategy for development in the 1980s. He called for an appropriate technology for industrialization based on restoring the indigenous technological patrimony both in the agricultural field and also in the artisanal field. So basically he expanded some of what Amami was talking about and expanded it to industry so as that you would restore and expand the indigenous artisanal technologies so as to carry out essentially a form of import substitution industrialization based on manufacturing, right? And this was also a heavy emphasis of the Arab auto-centered development current. Other theorists like Ismail Sabri Abdallah called for using renewable inputs into this process. So they were actually, again, using a very much an ecological critique, aware that they should not be using expensive imported inputs into the production process, and that this should not respond to the needs of the urban elite or even the urban middle classes, but that it should be based on a basic needs approach so that you would actually respond to the needs of the population. And it was on this basis that you could carry out an effective development strategy. And I thought I would connect this with the remainder of the Chai continent. Without corn, there's no country. It's a Mexican campesino slogan. And so I think very much that these themes speak very much to our question of sovereignty, because a lot of our debate here is about what is to be done and under what terms can it be done. And in fact, there is a lot being done right now around agroecology in every single country of the global south. It doesn't need the state, although you do need the state eventually, but it can be built starting from where things are now. The question is that how can that be enmeshed into a popular development program within an appropriate macroeconomic framework, which is why I'm particularly happy to be in a space like this to be able to benefit from the insights of people who actually understand properly macroeconomic development, which I do not, and so that these ideas can be developed together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max. So we will now open the floor for questions. Okay. Can someone with a microphone? Okay. So, and please keep the questions short.
Okay, I'll try and talk fast. I think it's absolutely brilliant that we've ended on a concept of delinking and asking what is to be done. But I'm afraid I am going to highlight a problem in the meantime, and that's about remittances. So it did come up in Mehdi's presentation, but I think there's been a bit of a gap in many talks, and the onus is on me, so no one take this as a criticism. But I think it's really important for a concept of monetary sovereignty to have an answer to a remittances agenda, which is a way for finance to work around the state, and it's something as old as commodified labour, which has contributed to development, but now there's a feeding frenzy from the financial institutions and Facebook and lots of corporations. Now, as economies are delinked, then remittances won't be so important, but at the moment, I think they need to be incorporated into a concept of monetary sovereignty, and there needs to be an answer to their financialization.
Okay. We had a question here.
First, I want to say thank you to all the panelists for fantastic presentations. Maybe I should start with just a quick comment on the remittances thing. I did talk about it in a critical sense, that it does weaken monetary sovereignty in the case of developing countries, where a country like Lebanon, 15% of GDP is remittances. That's not how you do economic development. So I agree, it's extremely important. On MMT, I agree with your analysis of the weaknesses in terms of the economic issues, which were highlighted in all the presentations. But I must say, with all due respect, you're completely misreading MMT. And it's partly not your fault, partly because of the name, the label, Modern Monetary Theory, which was not a label invented by any of the economists involved in MMT. It was some blogger who made it popular, and now we're stuck with it. But from an MMT perspective, money is the least important thing. This is really the core of our message, that it's the real productive capacity. So monetary sovereignty, even the way we defined it with the bullet points in terms of issuing your currency and not having external debt and all of that, That's actually a description of what happens when you reach the level of monetary sovereignty. But to get to that level of monetary sovereignty, you need to invest in all of these things we've been talking about: food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, focus on high value added content, de-link, all of these things. So money is, from an MMT perspective, you can think of it as an accounting mechanism that's symbolic, and it represents the real economic activity that takes place. In that sense, you can't run out of accounting units in the same sense that you can't run out of money. So if we're trying to measure things, physical, distances, we can't run out of centimeters and meters, but we can run out of physical space to measure. So in that sense, money is not important, it's the unit of account, and what's limited is the physical productive capacity, the technology, the know-how. In terms of a quick comment on, planning, we have no problem with planning in Tunisia. We use the 5-year plan since independence, right? And what Max was showing is very strong influence with the idea of planning. It's just, do you have the right plan? It's not about, if you're planning for export-led growth, then that's what you get. But if you're planning for food sovereignty, then you get food sovereignty. So we have no problem with planning. We want more planning, and that's specifically built into the MMT framework, that if you know the root causes of your problem, then you plan accordingly. And I'll say one thing to clarify, because I think a lot of people are trying to get a sense of, how do you actually do it? So let's say you hired, 500,000 people in Tunisia. You pay them in Tunisian dinar, local currency. There's no constraint there. That's not where the problem is. The problem is, what are they going to do when they spend their money? They're going to buy more food, they're going to buy more transportation. That's where you get to the food sovereignty and energy sovereignty part. So we have a planning mechanism, and all we have to do is wrap our heads around the correct plan, not the wrong plan.
Okay, so we had another question. Can you raise your hands again? Yes, it was you.
First of all, let me thank you for your interesting presentations. My question is a bit a comment and a question. So you talked about the weak immunity system of the economic side in Tunisia. You talked about the less diversified sectors, and you talked about the link with external countries, mainly the north. But there is a point which is, I feel it's a gap, and I'm talking about the brain drain. I think it's very important in shifting the balance in the economy. Thank you.
Okay. We take 2 more questions and then we stop for now.
Sorry, this is just a question. Thanks for excellent presentations. On MMT, I think that the solutions, Mehdi, you put were, pretty much what heterodox economists across the board would come forward with, in terms of what is possible within the system. So I don't think there's a problem there. Max, I think fabulous presentation, but just to bring the money issue into agriculture. We are not allowed to have dual currency systems since the 1976 change of the IMF Articles of Agreement, right? And up till that time, even Belgium had 2 dual currency system, right? And what we have in effect is the rich north subsidizes its cows more than it gives aid, right? There's billions, right, that goes into agriculture. So that is, in effect, a dual currency system because their agricultural exports are not competitive. So they bring the price down. Its effect is the same as a dual currency system. And we really need to look at what the Europeans and the Americans are doing, especially in the WTO and in these economic partnership agreements, because that is what they maintain, and they undermine local production, and they're vicious about it. And we need to be very clear, it's a dual currency system that needs to be exposed.
Okay.
Bon. Bonjour à tous. Bonjour, chers panélistes. Bon, je vais parler en français, hein, puisque, bon, pour ceux qui ne parlent pas français, on pourrait traduire en anglais. Alors, je m'appelle Merveille. Je suis originaire de la République démocratique du Congo. Et en même temps, je suis un économiste En fait, merci d'abord pour vos différentes présentations. Ça a été très enrichissant. Ma question, j'aimerais de savoir, concernant aujourd'hui, quand on voit en Afrique, il y a beaucoup de... Bon, les modèles économiques est plus basé sur la Chine, étant donné que la Chine s'est développée au travers de l'agriculture. Et aussi en Afrique, il y a beaucoup de pays qui ont comme... qui ont dans le secteur agricole peut assurer ces développements économiques. Mais ces secteurs semblent être négligés. Mais pourquoi n'est pas... bon, c'est vrai qu'on a tous, par rapport aux perspectives futures, de pouvoir développer ces secteurs. Mais pourquoi ces secteurs ne semblent pas toujours être... en fait... c'est un secteur prometteur, mais pourquoi ce secteur est toujours négligé? Et quels sont les plans de sauvetage pour pouvoir assurer cette souveraineté alimentaire dans différents pays africains? Et en assurant, par exemple, en élargissant les marchés multilatéraux.
Merci. Okay, we do one question here, and then we try to do one after. Yes, it's you.
Thank you very much for the very enjoyable presentations. I really liked, with the last presentation, looking at a Tunisian thinker with sort of South-South connections with China and Mexico. I thought was really good. And I liked Arndt Hopfmann's presentation a lot, and I think the focus on talking about communism and with a serious political economy focus and how it worked was really useful, and using money as a totally different way of measuring value and distribution. And you spoke about that in terms of why were these always economies of scarcity, but I think that scarcity is maybe more honest than a capitalist economy with a neoclassical paradigm, which creates the illusion of infinite resources and surplus, where any scarcity can be resolved by the sufficient supply of money, and all we need to do is mobilize and concentrate the amount of money. So are you proposing perhaps maybe a return to those sort of systems, and maybe the honesty that I think is built into them in that way? And a more minor question to tag on to that, with the discussions of food sovereignty, are maybe the export-import balance of food, maybe in dollar terms, maybe the wrong measure, because you can import very valuable food that's only eaten by the elites, and the food that most people produce and consume to stay alive never crosses a national boundary and never becomes an import or an export. So I feel that while it's an interesting measure, it maybe doesn't measure food sovereignty in the way that you're trying to talk about.
Okay, I'll let you answer these questions. I mean, you can start.
So just to take the last question,
Up. You can just start.
Yeah, okay. In terms of the last question, I mean, the import-export balances in Africa on the whole, in North Africa and Tunisia, are primarily based on cereal import. So it is the basic needs of the poor who are most of all dependent on imports. The rich as well, but it's a society-wide thing, and it's a question of particularly harming the poor. As for the question of why is the agricultural sector neglected, I mean, I think I wouldn't talk about the whole continent because I don't have this expertise. I mean, in Tunisia, what you had was the effective exclusion of smallholders from the post-colonial political pact. So they didn't have political power in the post-independence era, and thus their interests were, as producers and as consumers, as people interested in their own social reproduction and well-being, were excluded, and what was emphasized was an export orientation, because the export-oriented producers were included in the social pact and were part of political decision-making. And I think this is very much I mean, in some ways, this is going to be a continental phenomenon. So it's not neglect of agriculture as a sector. It's breaking out the class components of agriculture. I mean, you have the lower class smallholder producers who are excluded, and then you have export-oriented people, export-oriented larger plots who are not neglected at all.
Yeah, mine is very tricky because I had some answers for some thing to say to all of these questions. But let me focus on MMT and the correct plan. The correct plan is the real challenge in any regard. Whether you use money as a, let's say, a medium that can, with which you want to influence the way of investment is used and where it goes, or you have a planning committee or so, it is really difficult, and really the real challenge is to get a realistic plan that does not, let's say, create a situation where you use your resources. This will lead into unemployment probably, or you overuse your resources and we have terrible shortages in almost everywhere. This is the irony of the thing is, the more you are closer to your capacity limits, you will have the more shortages felt because any additional item cannot be produced anymore. So the closer you are, this is the real challenge. And the thing is, as an interesting, this is not the first thought to this point, there's an interesting article from Morozov in the review of New Left Review on. He says that with the digital revolution, socialist planning becomes more likely successful because we now have the machinery, the equipment, so to say, to process all the necessary data. I'm not completely with him, but at least I find it an interesting approach and an interesting attempt. So I recommend reading, so to say. The next thing, scarcity, and this fact fits completely into that. It is probably more honest, but because in reality there is always a shortage of resources and a real natural scarcity, and you can only with a currency that is international, that has an exchange rate that is also can be exchanged against hard currency or other currencies, try to overcome this shortage. And if you are in a country like the US, big country with having the world money so to say under control, you have actually no shortage at all. You can always with your money buy everything anywhere of the world. So meaning that the more problems with your money you have, or the weaker your money is, so to say, is that the more you feel this kind of scarcity. But the question of scarcity has also to do with the level of resource employment that you have already achieved. Because there's always a need for additional item and additional product. And then there's a physical limit, and then this appears as scarcity. So last point, size matters, meaning for all countries who are aiming on more self-reliance and more self-determination or sovereignty, you need to understand that China and Soviet Union were large countries with a lot of resources, a lot of people, and so they managed to get somehow an internal process of accumulation and resource extraction going. So, and for the smaller countries, this is also a clear lesson. You need to create regional integration. You need to create bigger economic units in order to overcome the shortages that a small country with a small population never can overcome. So there's a certain, let's say, necessity to have a certain size if you want to go into certain technology, use a certain technology more efficiently, or even develop this new technology yourself. You have to have a certain backup with resources and work power or manpower, as well as technology, as well as natural resources. Thank you. You had one.
To answer Hannah about remittances, remittances still remain an exogenous variable. One of the exogenous variable that I would like in general to have the least effect on the growth of the country, because remittances goes up and goes down depending on the economic situation of the country that hosts these Tunisians from overseas. So it's to be limited as far as its effect, so I'm not in disagreement with you, if I'm answering you correctly. Brain drain, absolutely, it's a major issue. There is a beautiful article written by Jan Kriegel, it's 2004 article, Two Views on the Obstacle to Development, where he lays down the issues of financing for development, and then comes up with the idea at the end that financing actually is not the most important thing. It's how do you make sure you accumulate your capital internally, and not just capital. It could be managerial skills. It could be human capital. So human capital in this thing is extremely important for Tunisians. And we were talking with each other earlier, and in my high school class of 26 students, 23 left, are not in Tunisia anymore. So it's a huge brain drain, and none of them are back to Tunisia. The Tunisian government does help with that in terms of subsidizing some of these students that go overseas and they never come back. Other countries do require that anybody that goes overseas to study has to come back to their original country and spend at least a number of years working in that country. The question here is that, okay, well, you come to Tunisia or any other country, and then what are you going to do? Is there a framework? Is there a specific policy that would put these people into productive work? And that's one of the things that MMT proposes in terms of giving the government the authority to reclaim its authority or reclaim its institutional authority to make sure that there's development that goes towards specific areas, not just random sectors. So I completely agree with that. As far as the heterodox, it's obviously it's very close. I didn't have the time to go through few of the issues where MMT has few problems here and there with other heterodox economists, mainly in terms of the exchange rate and what do we do with the exchange rate. Yesterday, Professor Fastbeck said, well, I can't believe we're still talking about the exchange rate. That's still a point of contention, whether you have a flexible exchange rate or managed exchange rate. And MMT economists have a goal of a flexible exchange rate because from a macro level, that's the only way that MMT policies work in terms of providing for the country enough economic space to operate at the internal level and have a full monetary policy and fiscal policy. You can only achieve that if you have a full flexible exchange rate. My argument, I didn't have the time to do that, but that there's a split in terms of the policy. There's a short-term policy and there's a long-term policy. The long-term policy, you can get into full flexible exchange rate. If you're in the short term, that's not going to work in the case of Tunisia. That's going to have important repercussions, so it needs to be a managed exchange rate that ultimately, over the long term, it can move into a long-term flexible exchange rate. So there's a few discrepancies between heterodox and MMT, but in general, you're absolutely right. It's almost the same.
Just to go to the exchange rate, the Chinese example shows that managing your exchange rate is not a bad thing.
Okay. Can only the people who are raising their hand before raise their hand? Because I think there were 3. Yeah. Can you?
Merci. Question pour Monsieur Guirat. In fact,
are you?
Yes, the last question maybe. Okay. For Monsieur Guirat, about the balance of payments, why doesn't Tunisia simply apply import restrictions? So it can do it under the WTO, but the government doesn't seem to be willing to use this right. So,
okay, thank you. Yeah. I'm really sorry because we're really running late, but I would really encourage you in the break, because we're having a break after this, to still engage with the panelists. Okay, so I will let you shortly reply to the questions and then we go into the break.
I realized first that I didn't affirm this question of the US and EU subsidies. This is a crucial issue that needs to be addressed in the agricultural and farming sector. In regards to our departed comrade who was asking about the water crisis, of course, it's a question of water management. and we should not use questions, Malthusian discourses of scarcity when we are discussing water. It's a question exactly of how to mobilize the available resources and what the appropriate technology is to do so. And, you know, there is a lot of Malthusian discourse, in fact, when it comes to planning in Africa under climate change, conditions of climate change, and the resurgence of Malthus. I mean, Malthus was only correct about one thing, which is that he hated poor people, and you know, he knew that about himself. But other than that, nothing that he said had any relevance other than as an attack on the poor. And so we should be wary of Malthusian discourses, and for exactly that same reason.
I have nothing to say. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to answer the last question about import restrictions. There's different issues with that. One of them is corruption at the customs border control to Tunisia, where a lot of importation is not legal. A lot of Chinese products are coming into Tunisia illegally. They're being sold in the streets, and that's a drain on the Tunisian reserves. So that's even outside any World Trade Organization policy. As far as the normal WTO legal restrictions that Tunisia can do, it's not that easy. There's other trade agreements that exist, especially the ones between the EU and Tunisia, that restrict any limitation of on imports. So any policy that Tunisia has to do, it has to take into account those restrictions that were imposed on it. On the other side, if we look at exports, Tunisian exports to the EU, they are themselves subject to draconian restrictions in terms of labeling, in terms of composition of certain products. So they can do it on their side, but we're having issues applying the same technique on our side. It's fairly easy to say a product that's coming in from a European country needs to have the correct labeling. If you buy a product that's coming from the EU and you look at the labeling, it's all written in French or in English or in German. It's very simple to say, well, it has to be fully 100% in Arabic. That's within WTO legal, it's legally doable, but they're not asking for that. So there's a bit of a political will that's not in place. What was another question? Oh, the informal sector. The gentleman left, asked his question, and took off, but I'll answer. He was asking about the informal sector in Tunisia, and that it doesn't really, whatever the numbers that I had were not accurate. Obviously, they're not accurate in terms of not taken into account the informal sector. That's why it's an informal sector. It's difficult to put those into numbers. So, but we have to work with those numbers. Apparently, it's about 35 to 40%, the informal sector in Tunisia. So it's not taxed and so on and so on. But it doesn't really matter if we're in an MMT framework. The country does not have to tax to spend. He also talked a little bit about the political problem. There was a political problem in Tunisia post-revolution. That it was, yeah. So it's post-2011. So we're fine. We can talk about it, and that's about it.
Thank you. We're now going into a 20-minute break, so please be back at 4:10, but please come back for the concluding panel, because we will in the concluding panel talk about what comes next and what do we actually do from here, and yeah, which next steps will we take together. Thank you.